This talk is going to be on the plasma dynamics aspect of the fractal field. And the idea is that we begin with the core concept of what makes fractality or self-similarity or phase conjugation or implosion, what allows that to create centripetal force. That's the core issue, because it is the theme behind everything we will be discussing. So in effect, we're wanting to know how it is that the universe in general creates forces that are centripetal, inward moving, implosive, and self-organizing. So this is a fairly radical physics, and it would seem possibly a bit, explosive in a certain way, because we're saying that, just one second, I'll turn off this other screen. We're saying that physics has failed to grapple with one pretty fundamental idea, and that is that the reason an object falls to the ground, the reason gravity exists, as it were, is because the force of charge is fractal or centripetal. So Einstein was clear that gravity equaled the constructive compression of electric charge. We say kind of jokingly that it was sad that no one told him what a fractal was, or he might have figured out that fractality is in fact the cause of that charge compression. He knew if charge was compressed perfectly, and when I say charge, you can think of plasma or ether or chi. It is the stuff of the unified field. In physics, for example, we say that plasma equals 99.99% of the universe. If you don't know what plasma is, you don't know what the universe is. And you can think of plasma as a cloud of charge. For example, the cloud of charge around your aura, your body. And when there is a way for that charge to create centripetal force, to be attracted towards center, you call that gravity. So we've effectively discovered and have some new evidence that fractality is the cause, as we explained. Perfected fractal phase conjugation of waves of charge is the electric origin, cause, and mechanism of all centripetal and self-organizing forces, including and especially gravity, life force, perception, bliss enlightenment, the origin of alphabet, the origin of color. It's a radical new physics, and we present evidence to that effect. First, let's look at some of the visuals. That if a set of waves were approaching center in a way that, for example, if you look on the top left here, you see this image of what in mythical literature would be called the caduceus. In physics, that's called phase conjugation, where waves approach a center in such a way that their compression, their phases and velocities, using golden ratio, as you can see, create the fusion of charge, the fusion of plasma. Perfected fusion is the perfected making of a black hole. How the compression can come to a center point and produce acceleration in such a way that none of the inertia of that charge is lost. That fusion at center is the issue, the essence, the substance of alchemy and the black hole, the Bindu point, etc. So we're going to use this specific geometry implied here to talk about the nature of DNA, the nature of hydrogen, and we're going to look at the way in which this geometry creates new technologies that can be applied to, for example, creating energy from hydrogen and purifying water. So this business about getting waves to agree perfectly, to fuse, as it were, is the exciting part of how we apply fractal field theory to technology. Now, I'd like to look at an example of this applied to a technology. I'm sure you're probably all familiar with the Joe cell. Just one second, I'm going to get a picture of my face up on the screen here for a moment so that the viewers up there can say hi to me too. 1 second. See if this is going to work. So we'll put me down here in the window so the folks in the field can see. And then I'll make this a little bit smaller, rearrange. So this is one of many pictures that's easy to find about the top-down view of what's called the Joe cell. We had the privilege of spending some time with Joe at Lismore, Australia. Notice that there are concentric rings here. The geometry of these concentric rings is creating more charge compression at center. So the bubbles you see are actually hydrogen that is being released from the water. Now, the fact that in this kind of geometry there is more hydrogen release at the center than at the periphery is indicating that whatever charge compression is happening, the centripetal force is being concentrated symmetrically with respect to center. And the process that accomplishes that has to do with the ratio of the size of those concentric rings, in this case metal cylinders, as you can see in some of the other images here. This is pretty well known. Lots of people have played with this. We believe we now have the physics to optimize this process. For example, if we take our little preamplifier, the bliss tuner, heart tuner, we can measure the capacitance, the charge, the voltage, at the center of this array and see where the electric field is achieving that concentration of compression optimally. It's called harmonic inclusiveness. That, namely, you would find out where the compression was being most constructive or fractal by spectrum analysis electrically. For example, when Joe says, to people, you need to know the direction in which the metal tube was extruded in order that the electric field is compressed perfectly, that's a clue to the fact that the symmetry of that electric field needs to be precise. And that is our key word here to understand the nature of that symmetry. And that symmetry is about plasma. Now, when I was chatting with Paul Harris about this in the car, I think it was yesterday, Paul was telling me about why the whales and the krill are so powerful. And he said it's because they ate plankton. And Paul was explaining to me that the plankton are so very smart. And the plankton, and there's apparently evidence that the plankton in the ocean, in their electrical collective mind, that when the colony of plankton decides we need a cloud, the plankton gets together and they make a cloud. And I would strongly hypothesize that if you look at the way the plankton collectively rearrange themselves when they know that they need to make a cloud, that they arrange themselves into a pattern roughly like this, which is not unlike what you see when Wilhelm Reich took concentric tubes and put them in a river and caused clouds to form, cloud busting. Now, it is my opinion that what Wilhelm Reich called in that case orgone is in fact what in physics would be more correctly labeled a phase conjugate dielectric field, a fractal field, a centripetal field due to phase conjugation. Now, so if we were looking down on those intelligent plasma, on those intelligent plankton, they knew how to gather their body collectively to affect their environment. And the way they do it is they make a centripetal force which collectively produces the electric field that causes clouds to form. And I think it's instructive to think about that because you call that precipitation, which, precipitation has meaning in physics and has meaning in ceremonial magic. And in both cases, precipitation is referring to what happens when charge, when waves of electric field are compressed. So, applying that to cloud formation, if you visualize there's all these little water vapor molecules hanging around, what causes them to form a droplet? What causes them to form a droplet is actually a centripetal electric force, a phase conjugate field. It's really quite simple. Water vapor molecules are like people that just came to a party and they're deciding whether or not they would like to touch. Now, if that party was being held in a metal building where the air is not fractal, it is less likely that those people would decide to touch each other than if, in fact, the party was being held in a wooden building or a sacred space where the air is fractal and a centripetal force was being created. Now, at this point, we should probably show an example of the measurement of a fractal field. That, Professor Karatkov, who is one of our heroes, he had been traveling to the sacred Kogi country and had been looking at the fact that when the tribal members wanted to talk to their ancestors, they would go to one particular part of the village. And if we look at that slide from it's called Fractality in African Architecture. And in African architecture, they noted, this is a famous film, we've talked about this before, Ron Eglash said that if you look at the classic African village, the shape of the village and the shape of the house within the village and the shape of the shaman's house and the shape of the altar inside the shaman's house, they all look like a pine cone, like a fractal. Yeah? The inside looks like the outside. Now, so the place you go to talk to your ancestors is the place in the center where all the waves of capacitive charge are converging non-destructively. And that's where druids make phone calls, as it were. Now, that's very good mythology, but let's have some physics, please. And the physics seems to be that, as Karakov discovered, that if you measure the air in that space, and here's the slide, we did this in East Sussex, UK, we put this probe under a sacred tree, and we found that the air is more fractal there. Whereas this is on the bottom, you see, this is the GDV electrode probe, and it's simply showing that in the place that you call sacred, a spark has some place to go. And that efficient distribution of charge defines sacred. In fact, it defines the divine. In fact, it defines life. Whereas if you put that same probe in a metal building somewhere, you see that there's no charge radiance. The GDV, gas discharge visualization, is a Curlian, it's a calibrated Curlian photograph, which means how the electric field is being distributed. If the electric field is being distributed perfectly, you call that life, mind, God, the divine, and sacred. If the electric field is not being distributed, you call that a place that doesn't feel so good, a metal building with dead air, okay? The thing is, once we understand that's measurable, we can take that principle and apply it to creating life and apply it to technologies that create life. So my presentation this afternoon will build on that idea that there is a particular electric field that creates life. Now, that's the next thing that I'd like to discuss. This is leading up to this idea of what electric field creates life, and is it fractal? I mentioned the book that I really enjoyed. It's called Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty by John Burke and Kaj Halbert. In this book, they present large amounts of evidence that, in fact, sacred sites like Stonehenge, for example, were actually built and used. Here's the slide, some pictures from that book. See if we can find it here. There it is. That if they discovered by archaeological study that if you take your seeds to the center of structures like Stonehenge and let them experience charge compression there and then plant them, that those seeds create dramatic improvements in growth and germination. Now, John Burke has developed a bit of a technology where he sprays a negative ion wind and creates a seed treatment to do something like that. But the point is that, you know, the conclusion of the book is kind of funny. It reminds me of, you know, the native people saying, let's chase down that Coke bottle because it fell from an airplane, so it must be God. And, you know, John Burke says, oh, okay, well then what you need to do is find a Stonehenge in your neighborhood and carry your seeds over there. I don't think that's actually the next step. No, I think the next step is to teach the physics of how you make the electric field that caused the seeds to germinate. And that's what we're about, and that's what Sal, over there, Sal Giannanoto, has helped me measure the success of. And this is Sal's measurement. He's going to talk more about this in his talk. On the bottom, you see, that's a plant that I think we had 2 or 3 weeks of growth there, if I recall, Sal. Yeah. And we had measured a 300% difference in growth by weight in that plant after we produced this particular field. Now, I'm going to explain to you a lot more this afternoon on how we create what I call the bioactive electric field. But I will tell you that it's based precisely on this principle of how centripetal forces in general are created. And that's why I'm so concerned that we understand correctly the electric generation of centripetal force. I'm going to bring up a screen here. This is applying this idea that phase conjugate fractality is the cause of gravity. I'm going to apply that to the nature of hydrogen. And I'm going to do that because that will be a beautiful example of how this can be applied in general to the entire atomic table. So here what we did, this is my original equation where I took the Planck length. The Planck length, in my view, defines the sacred in physics because it's the wavelength which fits evenly into everything in physics. There's no evidence that any other wavelength is sacred to physics. So the Planck length is sort of what we call the baby drool. It's a universal solvent. Everything can divide evenly into that. So it's the threshold of resolution of the quantum foam, as it were. So if you take that unit of length, the sacred in physics, and you multiply it by precisely the golden ratio, I discovered that equation was precisely predicting the three major radii of hydrogen. Now, there's a lot of work that's been done by a wonderful scientist named Hayrovsky, and he has dozens of published papers showing golden ratio in the structure of hydrogen. Three of the primary radii he found for hydrogen, I discovered. This is some of the pictures. This will catch up in just a moment on the screen for the virtual viewers here. That the exact size of those radii was predicted by precisely golden ratio times the Planck length. This means that, there is virtually zero, there's mathematically, statistically 0% chance that this is an accident. The fact that the size of hydrogen is precisely predicted by golden ratio to Planck indicates that literally this golden ratio is what's holding hydrogen together. And I'd like to show you a picture about that and discuss briefly what that means, because I think it is so central to our hypothesis about, here's the picture I want to show you. So I have an animation on top and a still on the bottom. It's coming into the virtual viewers here now. There we go. So if you look at the center here, think of this very center bottom as the Bindu point. Notice how that might look like a W. Later we're going to talk about TWT, Tahuti, David, as the two opposing ends of a cone which approach center and phase conjugate, which then became our Star of David. Yeah? That this is actually a name for the physics of the perfect approach of opposite cones. I'm going to bring up my face now just for a moment for our viewers here. That if opposite cones were approaching perfectly from opposite direction, in physics that's called phase conjugation, and it's the only way self-organization has ever been observed. So what we want to understand in this discussion is exactly how, I lost my picture here. Oh, that's the one I want, number 23. Exactly how that is the mechanism of the creation of centripetal force. If you want to track me with the camera for just a moment here. I want to discuss this image on the top here, that if you see that picture of 10 spirals of the golden mean, I want to point to it a different way. Just bear with me 1 second. There we go. So the viewers at home can see it as well. I'm discussing this top left image right here. And you and I are trying to understand, since that 10 spirals the golden mean, top left image, is precisely the top-down view of DNA and hydrogen, and if we believe Nature magazine and New Scientist magazine, the dodecahedral geometry of the universe, that hydrogen, DNA, and the universe have a top-down view, which is precisely this shape, 10 spirals of golden mean. This we're going to apply then to all of our work on fractal field theory. I'm going to get a three-dimensional model here. That's beautiful. And sound system has no feedback. Paul, you're amazing. Totally cool. So here's the 3D model. So this model in 3D is equivalent to what you're seeing there in the 10 spirals. And since that is the precise electrical geometry of fractality and phase conjugation, which is the cause of gravity, the cause of color, the cause of perception, the cause of life, the cause of enlightenment, the cause of bliss, the cause of color, and the origin of symbol, that it would then be very appropriate for us to understand precisely how that works. Because if we understand why that creates an electrical force which pulls toward center, it's called centripetal, opposite of centrifugal, implosive, opposite of explosive. If we understand precisely how and why there is centripetal force in that shape, then we can invent all the technologies of fractal field theory and understand the role of life in the universe. Okay, so if we understand just that one thing together right now at this moment of how that shape, since it's precisely the geometry of hydrogen, the universe, DNA, in fact, atoms have and make gravity only to the extent that their nucleus is fractal and self-similar to their electrons in exactly that way. So this is the cause of gravity, and now we need to understand how it works. And that's why I'm sitting in front of you at this moment, is to make that point, which is how we introduce the rest of everything we will discuss about applying fractal field theory to technology. So, the way it works is that the golden mean ratio, which is the centerpiece of the 10 golden mean spirals in 3D which assemble this model, the golden mean ratio allows the waves to add and multiply constructively. This is what Einstein missed. This is why Einstein never figured out why an object falls to the ground, right here. The point is that as the waves converge in that pattern, a certain portion of their electric charge, adding and multiplying the wavelength, also adds and multiplies constructively, called perfected heterodynine, adds and multiplies the wave velocity, the phase velocity. And so the portion of that charge that's moving toward the center, 10 spirals of the golden mean, the portion of that charge that's moving toward center that adds and multiplies the wave speed constructively, which only golden ratio can do, add and multiply constructively. And when waves get together, they have to add and multiply. That's why the golden mean ratio is the solution to constructive wave interference, and that's why golden mean ratio is the solution to constructive compression. And constructive compression is precisely what Einstein had a nightmare about because he couldn't figure it out. This is the solution. Because the adding and multiplying of that phase velocity means that a portion of the charge that was experiencing compression has its wave speed, its wave velocity, adding and multiplying. That means a portion of that charge turns compression into acceleration. I repeat, a portion of the charge, inertia of that wave, experiences acceleration because of golden ratio, because of fractality, because of phase conjugation, optimized by golden ratio. That means that some of the charge, some of the voltage, some of the pressure, unified field of charge, the plasma going towards center, suddenly finds itself pushed towards center. And that experience of acceleration is the definition of gravity. If you accelerate charge in physics, that is gravity, the only definition we have. So, do you now see what's happening to charge at the center of hydrogen, and therefore DNA? A portion of the inertia of that charge is experiencing perfected implosive fractal phase conjugate wave collapse. And that is the mechanism where centripetal force is created. And that is the cause and origin of gravity, color, perception, life, and bliss. A portion of that inertia that goes through the center at golden mean ratio multiples of the speed of light, and that creates the self-aware, self-organizing electric field. We have hundreds of papers showing that a phase conjugate dielectric is a self-aware electric field. A little bit of that field over here and here, they will find each other and locate each other remotely at a distance. exactly the physics of what you call the collective unconscious, what I call DNA radio. A self-aware electric field that gathers together only patterns that serve the survival of the all. So we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but if you want to study some really useful science that's self-empowering, I urge you to study the literature on phase conjugate dielectrics. Phase conjugation, the word conjugate, simply means to, like when you have conjugal relations with DNA, when you get married, the DNA finds out which waves are shareable. Isn't getting married a good way to find out which waves are shareable? Well, see, at the very center of this array, only waves that can survive compression with perfect phase discipline are able to be distributed. Now, this is going to lead us into a discussion